Is that open? That shouldn't be open. Let's go over here. Updates me via, no, I don't want updates right now. I don't want to update this right now. Let's do that. Let's do this. All right, so we're almost done, and well, we will finish with the immune system today. So we're talking about viruses. Viruses, there are two main types of viruses based on their genetic material. There are DNA viruses and RNA viruses. You now have a little bit more knowledge about viruses in the idea that viruses are either membrane sheathed or coated or not. And so sometimes the virus is simply a protein coat with its receptors, and there's other times where there's a protein coat on the inside and there's a membrane outside of that. The fact that some viruses have a membrane is extremely good news, because when viruses have a membrane, they are susceptible to temperature fluctuations and they're susceptible to UV light. So that's really good news for us. So usually we talk about bacteria as being a microorganism or a microbe, and what's cool is even bacteria have to deal with viruses. There's a class of viruses called a bacteriophage, and it looks like a molecular spider. This is not an artistic impression. This is the way these viruses look under the electron microscope. Google it, they're fascinating. The phage lands on the surface of the bacteria and then squats down, and there's this spiral protein, looks like a spring, and what it literally does is it injects the genetic material of the virus, kind of like a syringe. It's really cool. The genetic material is then injected into the host. The viral DNA then expresses different proteins. One of the proteins digests the genome of the host, so the only genetic material in the bacteria is viral DNA. Then the host cell just becomes a viral factory. This is the hallmark characteristic of viral infections. I refer to viruses as they're molecular pirates, and they take over the biochemistry of the cell, and the cell then turns into nothing more than a viral factory. And in this example with bacteriophages, the cell fills with virus until it literally pops like an overinflated balloon. And since the plasma membrane is split or lysed, this is referred to as the lytic cycle. And the cell pops, and now you have the completed viral life cycle, and the virus simply goes on to infect other cells. And its whole goal, it is a biological machine, is simply to bond to other cells and make more virus. So these are viruses that only infect bacteria. So then we got into a virus that we are all familiar with, HIV. So the good news about HIV is that it is a membrane-bound virus. So this is susceptible to temperature changes and UV light. That's super good news. So that way HIV can't sit on a doorknob. HIV can't sit on any other public surface, and you go by and you touch that doorknob and then, oh, I caught HIV. It's not the way it works at all. And that's also good news, because that's since HIV is carried in very high concentrations in blood. Any insect that can transfer blood-borne pathogens from one human to another, fleas, ticks, mites, mosquitoes, none of these bugs can transmit HIV, and that is really good news. The reason why mosquitoes or any other blood transferable bug cannot transfer HIV is because there's a temperature fluctuation between our body temperature and the body temperature of the bug. There's a dramatic drop in temperature that makes the membrane, the plasma membrane that surrounds HIV, dissolve. And embedded in that membrane is a protein, a glycoprotein, as a matter of fact, whose molecular weight is 120. So we call it GP120. This protein is a heavily studied protein. Because GP120 is the reason why HIV is able to infect white blood cells. Okay, HIV is specific to your white blood cells. Why? Because white blood cells have a receptor called CD4, and CD4 is the receptor that white blood cells use to communicate. Okay, so GP120 is a docking protein, a receptor protein that matches the CD4 receptor that's present in all white blood cells. So this is why HIV infects white blood cells. Then why HIV is also unique is HIV belongs to the family of virus that are RNA driven. Okay, their genetic material is RNA. So what these cells, what these virus then have the ability to do is they inject their RNA and then they do transcription backwards. Okay, we are used to seeing transcription of DNA to RNA, right? I mean, that's central dogma, right? Well, here the biochemistry of the cell is driven backwards from RNA backwards to DNA. So the enzyme that does that, of course, is a transcriptase because it's a DNA to RNA enzyme. Except since you're going RNA backwards to DNA, we refer to it as a reverse transcriptase. So since this biochemical process is backwards, anything that is going back is referred to as retro, right? This is usually applied to clothing. So we refer to RNA viruses as retroviruses because they do transcription backwards. They go from their RNA backwards to DNA. Now, that's usually where retroviruses stop, okay? But HIV has this sneaky little characteristic in that it then splices its viral DNA into the genome of the host, right? And the bad news on that is that means it doesn't kill the host cell for years, maybe even a decade, right? Well, the host then reads reads DNA transcription to make messenger RNA, then reads the messenger RNA translation to make proteins, and suddenly this white blood cell becomes an HIV factory for 5, 10, 15 years. And so these white blood cells then shed or bud virus. And so that's why an HIV patient or an individual that is HIV positive, that's why the concentration of virus in certain bodily fluids increases. It's what we call their viral load, because their white blood cells just sit there and shed HIV, right? And then these HIV viruses then turn around and infect more white blood cells, which then shed more HIV. And it is this positive feedback loop that elevates the concentration of HIV until the HIV infects so many of the white blood cells for such a long period of time that these cells start to die. So as HIV concentration increases, what happens to your white blood cell count?
Decreases.
Starts to decrease. Okay. Well, we just got done talking about the job of the white blood cells. The white blood cells protect you from what? What do white blood cells protect you from? Yeah, just about everything, right? From bacteria to other virus to fungus, okay? So as your white blood cell count drops, you are losing your protection from infection until eventually your white blood cell count gets so low that you don't have any protection, and you now have an acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. You now have developed AIDS. You don't catch AIDS. AIDS is a development. AIDS is a symptom of an HIV infection. Okay. Now, when people talk about an HIV test, or sometimes people will call it an AIDS test, those aren't accurate terms at all. What they really test you for are the antibodies, since the antibodies to the virus are at a much higher concentration in your bodily fluids. So we need to talk about question 3F now. And now that you have a background in HIV, I need to be sure to talk about the specifics of HIV. I need to be sure and answer your questions about HIV, because which age group is most commonly infected with HIV?
Teens.
Yeah, you guys. Okay, 16 to about 22, 16 to 25, depending on the population you look at. And that is in my opinion, that is because of the development of your frontal lobe, in that you don't have the full development and the full perspective of what could possibly happen. And so that younger age group tends to think it'll never happen to me, or, oh, the risk isn't that bad. And then that individual then participates in behavior that exposes them to HIV. They then get it, and then they then become the guest speaker of, hey, don't make the same bad decisions I did. And, even though I was told it wouldn't happen to me, and I thought it wouldn't happen to me, it happened to me. That's where those guest speakers come from. So all we can do is lay the information in front of you and say, hey, this isn't worth the risk. And you guys are adults and you'll make your own decision. So HIV. HIV is an acronym. It stands for Human Immunodeficiency. What is a deficiency? What does it mean to be deficient?
Not being good enough.
Yep, not having enough. So what they're referring to when they talk about a deficiency is you don't have enough strength in your immune system. So this is a virus that causes your immune system to become deficient. It's a virus that weakens your immune system, but it's called human. So hold it. There are immunodeficiency viruses for other species? Yes. There's one that actually affects a lot of other primates. It's called a simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV. There's even an immunodeficiency virus for cats, FIV, feline immunodeficiency virus. Okay. So what's interesting about SIV? SIV affects chimpanzees. It affects gorillas. It infects bonobos. But orangutans, you guys ever seen an orangutan? They're the orange guys with the really long hair. They kind of look like when a sniper dresses up in their gear, right? To me, whenever I see a sniper, I think orangutan, and every time I see orangutan, I think sniper. But do you know those orange animals that I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
They are immune to SIV. You inject SIV into them, that affects every other primate in their group, and it affects gorillas, and it affects chimps. And you give it to orangutans, and the immune system of the orangutan chews that virus up. And we still don't understand why. So if you're interested in virology and you're interested in virus research, you may end up working with orangutans and figuring out why they're able to chew that virus up. Because as a primate, is their immune system and our immune system similar?
Yeah.
Very, 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 very similar. So if you can figure out how they're doing it, you may be able to then transfer that information to us. All right. So when HIV first came out, in the early 1980s, it was known as a sexually transmitted infection. This virus first broke out in homosexual males, and there's a specific reason why. Homosexual males will participate in anal sex. During anal sex, there may be semen to blood contact, and both semen and blood, if the person is HIV positive, has extremely high concentrations of HIV. So semen and blood are two of the body fluids that you have to keep yourself away from. So HIV was originally seen as an STI and transferred sexually. This is in the early 1980s. You need to read about the history of HIV in the early 1980s. There's a lot of history behind this. When I was in high school and first heard of this virus, it wasn't called HIV. Do you guys know the history behind this? Do you know what they originally called HIV?
No.
Nope. They called it GRID. Wow, that was a perfect shot. Okay, they called this GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, as if the biology knew the sexual preference of the individuals who are expressing the symptoms. This blows my mind. As a biologist, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. All right? Because regardless of how you feel about sexuality and marriage and politics, I mean, set all of that stuff aside, Does biology know anything about a person's political party or sexual orientation?
No.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Okay. So for the media in the 80s, in the early 1980s, to put this information out, it was amazing. It was like, you've got to be kidding me. So there's a lot of history here, and you should look it up. Not exactly part of my curriculum. I would love to teach a history class on HIV and AIDS in the late 70s and early 80s, but it's beyond the scope of this course. But there's a thing called Google, and to be educated, I think you should look it up. So it then became evident by the mid 80s that this was also a blood-borne pathogen. What does that mean? It means it can be transmitted through the blood. And so in the 80s, the HIV was present in the blood supply. Okay, HIV is no longer present in the blood supply. I don't want you thinking if you go in for surgery and you get a blood transfusion, holy cow, I'm going to become HIV positive. And it's not the way it works, because we have screening processes now that have eliminated this virus from the blood supply. But in the 80s, it was there. This is why there was an outbreak in the 1980s of HIV in hemophiliacs, because one of the treatments for hemophilia is a blood transfusion. And so you started getting in individuals who were hemophiliacs, and they were turning positive for HIV. And so that was the original data that HIV was present in the blood supply. It's not there anymore. We're talking, oh my gosh, the 80s are now 40 years ago. That's amazing. Okay, so HIV is transmitted in bodily fluids with high HIV concentration. And I really want you to stress that. I don't want you thinking that, if you come in contact with someone's saliva, that you're going to be exposed to an HIV concentration that's so high that you can pick up HIV. That's not the way it works. So bodily fluids with high HIV concentration will thus transmit HIV. But it has to be a high HIV concentration. There's a fancy term for viral concentration. We refer to that as viral load. Okay, when people talk about, oh, what's the viral load in blood? What's the viral load in saliva? What's the viral load in vaginal secretions or semen or feces or urine or sweat? This is what is the concentration of the virus in any fluid, and the viral load has to reach, it's called a threshold, has to reach a certain threshold or a certain concentration before transmission can occur. Okay, so of course, we need you to be comfortable with what bodily fluids can and cannot transmit HIV through viral concentrations. So bodily fluids that can, and again, let's stress that, can, there it is, transmit HIV. HIV. This would be semen, the fluid that is released by males when he ejaculates during sexual contact. Then we can have vaginal secretions. So during intercourse, the female responds by the lining of the vagina, producing a low viscous fluid. It's I don't want to call it a mucus, because then you'll think of a dense fluid, but it's not watery. It's a low density mucus that acts as a lubricant during intercourse. Those vaginal secretions, if the person is HIV positive, have a very high viral load. Breast milk. Breast milk has a high viral load, and then of course blood. Okay, those are the only 4 bodily fluids that have an HIV concentration or have a viral load high enough to allow transmission if the individual is HIV positive. So what fluids are not on that list?
Sweat.
Sweat,
Saliva.
saliva,
Urine.
urine. I'll go ahead and say poop.
Feces.
Yes, feces. Thank you for using the technical term while your teacher uses poop. What's the last one? Tears. Okay, so saliva, tears, urine, feces, sweat. Those five fluids, if someone is HIV positive, you can be exposed to those five fluids and you will not transmit or receive HIV in a high enough concentration to allow transmission. Okay. However, semen, vaginal secretions, breast milk, and blood do have a high enough viral concentration, if the individual is HIV positive, to allow transmission. Okay. So you can protect yourself from semen and vaginal secretion one of two ways. Okay. One way is abstinence. Don't have sexual intercourse or sexual contact. Okay. You guys are adults. If you decide to do this, fine. If you decide not to do this, fine. You're adults, your decisions. Okay. One of the beauties of being an adult is that you get to make your own decisions. One of the drawbacks is those decisions have consequences that you and you alone are responsible for. Okay. So whether you abstain or whether you use safe sex, latex condoms, totally up to you, right? It's your business, none of mine, right? I will provide the information, and what you decide to do with that information is totally up to you. Now with blood, the screening process for the blood supply now, there is no HIV in the blood supply. Okay, that was true 40 years ago. It isn't true now. However, some people still, it makes them uncomfortable to get a blood transfusion. I understand that. So if you know a surgery is coming, you have the option that you can go in and you can donate your own blood, and they will store it for you. They're going to charge you, of course, but you can store your own blood, so that way when you go in for your surgery, you are receiving your own blood back. Okay, if you're interested in that, fine. Then breast milk. The transmission of HIV from mother to child can occur through the breast milk. And you go, how's that possible? Well, I don't know if you've ever been around children when they teeth, but as the teeth erupt through the gum line literally splits as the tooth erupts through the gum line. Well, since the gum tissue splits, that then exposes the blood vessels. And if mom is HIV positive and the child then, as it drinks the breast milk, you are then bathing those exposed blood vessels with a fluid that has a high HIV viral load if mom is HIV positive. So they ask HIV positive mothers to not breastfeed their child. And you say, hold it, HIV mothers can give birth? Absolutely. What's fascinating about the placenta, there's some biochemistry there that we don't fully understand. The virus is incredibly small. And the blood vessel walls are so porous that when you're just looking at the size of the virus, HIV should be able to go straight from mom's blood directly into the offspring's blood. It should be an absolute no-brainer because the blood vessel walls are porous and the virus is tiny. But the data tells us that if mom is HIV positive, only about a third, they only have about a 30 to 35% chance of the offspring being HIV positive. And we don't know why. Somehow the placenta or the offspring's immune system, there's some biochemistry there that the transmission of HIV from the birth mother to the offspring is blocked 60 to 70% of the time. And we don't know why. So again, if this interests you, you're going to study placentas and try to figure out that biochemistry. It's a really big deal. All right, so what does HIV do? HIV infects and eventually kills white blood cells. That's what makes HIV so dangerous. It destroys your cells whose job it is to protect you. So what HIV does is it destroys, oh, I guess that S is a little distance, destroys your protection from infection. And let's fix that X, that S bothering me. There we go, that's much better. Okay. Now here's what's interesting. HIV does not kill you. And students go, whoa, man, come on. You just said HIV doesn't kill you. Nope. And you say, but okay, depending on your health and your age and your access to medical care, your life expectancy after getting HIV, 5, 7 years, 10, 15, really depends. Okay, one of the benefits, and I'm using that word very usefully, one of the benefits of Magic Johnson contracting HIV is that HIV was seen in the 80s and 90s as a dirty virus. Only people who were socially unaccepted at the time, and only drug addicts, because they share. So only those dirty drug addicts would get HIV. The bias and viral bigotry was bad. And then here is this athletic stud, this very popular athlete gets HIV from unprotected sex, and it really destigmatized HIV. Magic Johnson has done an absolutely phenomenal job in being transparent with his infection and talking about it very openly and very publicly. The one drawback is Magic has now had HIV for 20 years. And so people go, hold it. I thought you said that we die within 7 to 10 years of getting HIV. Okay, the average person like you and I dies within 7 to 10 years, okay? Because you and I don't have the access to the medical care that he does. Now, I'm not criticizing him at all. I'm trying to explain why you will see from academia, we will tell you 7 to 10 years, and you're like, dude, there's this guy named Magic Johnson, and he's been hanging around for 20 years. Your data doesn't work. He's the exception because of his access to medical care, which is then a whole nother discussion if you want to talk about medical care and medical insurance and access and socialized medicine. I should teach a politics class. That'd be great. Okay, so HIV does not kill you. Then what kills you? If HIV doesn't kill you, what does?
The lack of white blood cells.
Yes, the lack of white blood cells. You have no protection. So then what gets you?
Common cold.
Yes. Something as simple as a common cold. It's the secondary infection that kills you. Okay? Could be the common cold. Okay? When HIV was first identified as the causing microbe for AIDS, it was discovered by a team at the Institute in France. A team that was led by a gentleman named Luc Montagnier, and they were doing an autopsy on a woman who died by she had an infection of a cat virus. She picked up a virus from her cat, right? Now, do you think you and I usually have to worry about the viruses that infect birds and dogs and cats that live in our homes?
No.
Not at all. Okay. And so the story goes that they were in the middle of this dissection, and they were looking at her internal anatomy and seeing the destruction that a cat virus did to a human being. And someone on the team said, man, it's like she doesn't have an immune system at all. And that was the aha moment. And they all looked at each other and went, holy smokes, she doesn't have, something's destroying the immune system. And that was it. Okay. And so Montagnier received the Nobel Prize, and he is credited with, another amazing human being. He is credited with the discovery team of the discovery of HIV at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, France. So what gets you? What you just said is spot on. The common cold, the flu can take you out. There's a bacteria called pneumococcus. And so pneumococcus bacteria causes fluid to gather in your lungs, and you drown is what really happens. So that condition is called pneumonia. You can die of a fungal infection. Something as easy as an ear infection that can start in your ear canal, and because of the proximity, it can go to your brain and kill you. certain forms of cancer. There's a specific form of cancer that was part of the discovery of HIV called Kaposi sarcoma, if you want to know. IB will never ask you about Kaposi sarcoma, but this is a form of skin cancer, usually only seen, get a load of this, in Greek men. That in the Greek culture, the males go on the beach and literally, I mean, they sunbathe and sunbathe and sunbathe. They make Trump look pale. I mean, they are sunbathers. And so Kaposi sarcoma is extremely common in Greek males. It's actually heavily studied because you have this population that this is actually common in Greek males. It's amazing. So in the early 1980s, they started seeing Kaposi sarcoma break out in 20-year-old males in New York. And they're like, why are 20-year-old males in New York symptom? AIDS is a syndrome. AIDS is something that you develop and is an expression of your HIV infection. So it's called AIDS, AIDS, which is also an acronym for acquired immunodeficiency. Let's see if I can fit this in. Syndrome. Come on, man, you can do it. There you go. Done. And you go, hold it. Acquired. What do we mean by acquired? What does it mean to acquire? Good grief, our culture is famous for acquisition. What does it mean to acquire?
To get.
Get, right? Get stuff, right? Our culture is so into acquiring that in a country where we have people that are homeless, we have other people that acquire so much stuff that they rent storage facilities, extra stuff. Right? Socially, I really struggle with that. So to acquire is to get, okay? So why are they saying acquired? Because that means that your immunodeficiency happened after birth, okay? So there are individuals that are born with, let me cover this, there are individuals that are born with an immune system that doesn't work, okay? And since their immune system doesn't work, they are born with what's called IDS, okay? IDS is a genetic disorder where their immune system doesn't work, okay? And that is a genetic DNA-based issue, okay? Whereas this is acquired immunodeficiency, and that means that your immune system has broken down after birth, okay? So this is a condition. It is not an infection. It is not contagious. HIV is caused by AIDS is caused by HIV infection. Okay. So AIDS is a development. AIDS is developed in response or as a result of your HIV infection. It's a stage of your infection, okay? And clinically, what the definition of AIDS is this is when your immune system collapses. I'm riding on kind of a hill here. That's interesting. And when your immune system collapses, you have no protection from infection. So what can you be infected by? Ready? Anything. Okay. Now, at the same time, this is pretty heavy duty content. I mean, I'm between talking about my family and talking about the content today, I'm kind of laying it on you. My apologies. At the same time, I don't want you leaving class today afraid of HIV. Okay. I don't want you leaving HIV and I should worry. First COVID, and now I got me worried about HIV. And that's not the case. Okay. Do you need to be worried about HIV at all? Okay. I don't think you need to be worried. You need to be aware. There's a big difference between being aware and being worried. Okay. Is it straightforward how to protect yourself from HIV?
Yes.
Yes, it's extremely straightforward, okay? While this is really serious, while an HIV infection is life-threatening, I'm not trying to bum you out here, and I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to inform you. I want you to be rock solid and comfortable that as long as you stay away from exposure directly to semen, vaginal secretions, breast milk, and blood that are infected with the HIV virus, you will be protected from HIV. Okay, it's that simple. So there are discussions where people will say, you should abstain, and there's people that say we should give condoms out in high schools, and and there's a lot of discussion here, but ultimately this is a very personal, this is a very mature and adult decision. I had a health teacher in high school. She was and she openly said that if you're not mature enough to walk into a drugstore and buy a box of condoms and go, hey, I'm having sex, I'm buying a box of condoms, and because I'm being mature and I'm making good decisions, boom, I'm going to buy me a box of condoms. Okay, then she didn't think that you should be having sex, and I sat there and I thought, I understand that. I am a proponent that when you are an adult, you're going to make adult decisions. And so you have an adult decision to make. Are you going to abstain? Are you going to practice unprotected sex? Are you going to go into the drugstore or the grocery store and you're going to buy condoms and have protected sex? Who am I to tell you what you should do? My role is to provide the information and say, hey, you have 3 choices, and as an adult, you should make them. There are 2 things that I need to be sure and tell you, though, if you decide to use condoms, all right? First of all, do not carry condoms in any place where it gets warm. Not in your pocket, not in your wallet, not in a bag you keep in your trunk, not in your backpack, not in the glove compartment of your car, okay? Because when the latex is rolled up and gets really warm, the layers of the latex stick together. And so that way, when you then unroll the condom, these layers will then tear, and that puts micro holes in the condom, and the condom will then leak, and therefore you don't have any protection at all. You also have to be aware of the lubricant that you use, okay? People will use Vaseline as a lubricant during intercourse. You cannot do that because Vaseline is a petroleum product that dissolves the material in the condom, okay? So there are lubricants that will be sold in the same the prophylactics, the condoms, and they do not dissolve the condom. So there's information that you need to be aware of. I am encouraging abstinence. I am not discouraging abstinence. I'm not encouraging condom use. I'm not discouraging condom use. I want you all to be informed and lay the information in front of you and say, here's the information. Now, in a forum like this, you may or may not be comfortable asking questions. Fine with me. I've been answering questions about HIV for 30 years. So any questions that you have, I am open to answering. Okay, if you would rather text me privately, fine. You want to email me, fine. I will answer any questions that you have because you are in the age group that is most commonly infected with HIV. All right, 16 to about 22, 23. That is the most commonly infected population. So we have to inform you and we have to help you protect yourselves. And how you do that is totally up to you. Man, did that sound like a public service announcement. And I totally sound like a parent and a dad. And I'm okay with that because it's true. Okay. So on that note, do you have any questions? There's a loaded question for you.
I thought there was like a cure. I don't know if it was for HIV or AIDS, but like I always thought there was like a cure for one of them. I don't know why, but I just always thought like I heard that.
Okay, so there are treatments that slow down the reproductive cycle of HIV. We do not yet have a treatment that blocks HIV infection. There are HIV vaccines that are in human trials that have not been approved by the FDA yet. Oh, one day, right? There are treatments. The most common treatment is a drug called interferon, and it's called interferon because it bonds to the enzyme like reverse transcriptase and inhibits Just pour it in, don't worry about it. It inhibits the reproductive cycle and the biochemistry of HIV. So there are different treatments that slow down the reproduction of HIV, but we don't have a way to prevent it yet. Not without harming the patient. We can block that CD4 receptor, easy. I mean, seriously, that is super easy. But as soon as you block that CD4 receptor, you shut down the person's immune system, and you just gave them medically induced AIDS. And you just pretty much signed the death sentence of your patient. So while there are treatments, there are not cures. That's where the discussion of how expensive these treatments are. These treatments are extremely expensive because it takes a lot of research money to develop them. And then there's not a lot, I have to be really careful how I say this. From a business standpoint, there is not as large a group of patients to serve than something like, let's say, blood pressure, okay? There's a really, and I don't remember if Dawn and I talked about this, I hope she talked about this when we came into your TOK class, in that drug companies develop pharmaceuticals, compounds that treat the maximum number of patients. Why do they do that? Because they're a business, okay? And the more people buy their product, the more money they make. So when there's fewer people that can buy their product, the cost of it tends to go up. So the treatments are really, really expensive. But back to your original question, I am not aware, and if you find anything, please send it to me. I am not aware of any cures for an HIV infection. Man, I wish. Any other questions?
Mr. Manro, you said that homophiliacs, when they get like blood transfusions or like that in the past they had AIDS and HIV in them. So they were seen like as like dirty, you can say, like in the 80s, like they were seen as like in that like stereotype because people thought that they had anal sex. Yes.
Okay. So in the early 1980s, there was a president named Ronald Reagan. He was in office for 8 years. He was a Republican. And so when HIV first broke out in homosexual males, the government did not have the Centers of Disease Control study it. Why? Because it was decided, since that broke out in homosexual males, we are not going to study that. The HIV then progressed to intravenous drug users, IV drug users. What does intravenous mean? It means between veins. So if I'm someone who injects, let's say, heroin, right? So I'm HIV positive, I take the needle, I poke it into my vein, I inject the heroin. When I pull the needle out, my blood with its high viral load of HIV is now on the end of the needle. You and I then share needles. You use that same needle, stick it into your vein, and we just had blood-to-blood contact. So then HIV broke out in the intravenous drug user population. Then it broke out in prostitutes. So in the early 1980s, you had homosexual males, drug users, and prostitutes all breaking out with HIV in New York. And the federal government did nothing. This isn't my political opinion. Look up the data, look up the history, okay? It wasn't until HIV started to infect the hemophiliac population, then people started to take it seriously and realize that HIV was not a dirty virus, that HIV was not grid, and that HIV was not associated with your social and sexual practices in groups that you may or may not approve of, okay? And ultimately, there was a study from the CDC where they studied hemophiliacs, okay? And they said, look, HIV is in the blood supply. We need to clean up the blood supply. And the federal government said it's not a problem. The CDC said, look, study after study, hemophiliacs are getting HIV from the blood supply. The formal response from the federal government was, well, those people are either, what did they call it back then when they weren't public with their sexuality? They called them closet. They're either closeted homosexuals, or they're drug users, or they're cheating and they're using prostitutes. Okay, So there was a gentleman at the CDC, and it's killing me. I can't think of his name right now. I can see his face, and I can't think of his name. He did a study on hemophiliac babies. Okay, he had to use babies. Why? Because babies don't have a sexual preference, babies don't use drugs, and babies don't use prostitutes. And that's how he finally got the federal government to acknowledge that HIV was in the blood supply, because they did a study on hemophiliac babies. Look it up. And let me ask Don or Em. I can't think of the guy's name. It's really important. Hi, quick question. Who was the gentleman at the CDC who he's the presenter? You and I went to go see him at, in Balboa Park. I have his autograph. He signed the book.
And the band played on.
And the band played on. What's his name?
The head of the CDC at
He
the time.
was the CDC that, by the way, after he published the study on the hemophiliac infants, they fired him from the CDC. He then went on to open his own pharmaceutical company and developed the world's leading HIV antibody test that still exists to this day. It's still the best test in the world. Dan, can you guys let me Google it? Give me just a minute. CDC and the band. This is like not being able to think of Louis Pasteur. This is ridiculous. The band played on, what was his name? Don something. Don Francis. There it is.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Sorry. You need to look up Don Francis. There we go. He's the gentleman who worked for the CDC in the 80s, and he put out the study about the hemophilia and got Reagan to acknowledge that HIV was in the blood supply, and that led to us testing and cleaning up the blood supply. Super important dude. And we saw a presentation by him. Oh my gosh, that's when I first started teaching. That was 97, 98. He spoke in Balboa Park, and it was awesome. And then at the end, he said, anybody who has questions, and I brought a whole list of questions. I was very patient. And then he said, and I actually waited. I knew, because I had like 15, 20 questions. And he said, and so I pulled out my piece of paper, and he just looked at me and smiled, and I said, do you have the time? And he actually sat down in the first row of the theater and just talked to me. And I am forever in his debt. And so here's this world-renowned virologist sitting down with the high school teacher, and I had a little it was amazing. So anyway, look up Don Francis. He's a really good dude, and the science that he did 40 years ago is really important to public health and cleaning up the blood supply.